The perfect martini doesn't exist, but the perfect martini for you does exist. And today I'm going to show you how to find it. Welcome to Essential Cocktails. So the martini is not one of those drinks where you can just walk into a bar, order a martini and get exactly the drink that you want. When it comes to ordering a martini, there are lots of things to consider, a lot of questions you'll be asked, and a lot of decisions to make. So today I'm going to talk you through those decisions and the top 7 decisions you have to make in order to make your own perfect martini. So the origins of the martini have a pretty clear lineage, which you can track, starting with a Manhattan. So a Manhattan is a very old drink, which had a whiskey base, and still does have a whiskey base, vermouth and bitters, and then that kind of evolved over time into a drink called a Martinez. So a Martinez, rather than having the bourbon or the rye base, has gin. It also has vermouth in there, still sweet vermouth, and then a couple of drops of orange bitters and a little bit of cherry liqueur. And then from there, we have the martini, which is what we're talking about today. So we have a spirit base, we have vermouth or a wine-based aperitif, bitters, sometimes but not always, which we'll talk about today, and then we have a garnish, which we'll also talk about. So the 7 considerations we're going to talk about today to help you find your perfect martini are: number 1, the spirit base; number 2, the ratio; number 3, bitters or no bitters; number 4, the method; number 5, dilution; number 6, the glass; and then finally number 7, the garnish. And when you've worked out your preferences in all these sections, you'll be able to find your perfect martini. So the first decision you make, which is a really important one, is whether you go for a vodka martini or a gin martini, with either vodka or gin at the base. And this is a big decision. If you're going to go for a vodka, I do recommend spending a little bit more money than you would otherwise for mixing, maybe for a potato vodka, which has that really nice creamy body. But if you're going to go for a gin, choose the gin you love. All sorts of gins have different makeups of botanicals and flavors and ingredients, so whichever one's your favorite is going to make a really nice martini. But whichever you go for, number 1 tip here is to keep this in the freezer. So this gin is a Colwith Farm Distillery dry gin, and it's just got a really nice makeup of characteristics, and this has been in the freezer to get it really, really nice and cold. And just bear in mind, because these are really high ABV, they're not going to freeze, so you can even keep these in the freezer to be ready to go whenever you want a martini. Something you can do here is blend the two together, so part vodka, part gin, with a bit of Quina Lillet, which is a classic wine-based aperitif, or even Lillet Blanc, which is a more recent version, and that's going to be your Vesper martini, which is, to some, the perfect martini, to others not. So you can also experiment with that. So now we've chosen our base spirit, which today is going to be gin, but for you might be vodka. We can move on to point number 2, which is our ratio. So now we've got our gin or our vodka ready to go. We need to think about what we're going to pair this with, which is going to be a vermouth or a wine-based aperitif, depending on your preference. So I've got a couple here which I think are really good options. Martini Extra Dry is a really kind of classic option, quite light, quite clean and readily available, so it's going to make a really good martini. But I really like these two, which have a little bit more complexity, a little bit more body, and kind of floral notes, a little bit more going on in there, which I think is really nice. So technically these aren't vermouths, they're both aperitif wines, but they're more than acceptable in a martini. First of all, we've got Cocky Americano, and then second of all, we've got Lillet. And what I recommend doing here, if you can, is to taste these, get an idea of what you think they bring to the drink, and then choosing a martini based on the combination of the gin and the vermouth, or the vodka and the vermouth. So now we've got an idea of what we're going to pair with our spirit. We need to think about that ratio that I was talking about. So this is kind of a sliding scale. There's no right and wrong here. Over here, we have very dry martinis. Over here, we have a wet martini. And within that, there's kind of lots of variation. You can look at this as a ratio. You can look at it as dry, wet, whatever you want. But the easiest way to do this is to work out exactly how much spirit, exactly how much of your aperitif wine or your vermouth, and then work out, I think the ratio here is the most important. So over here, we have very dry martinis, which are really driven by our spirits. So this might be a 12-to-1, 12 part spirit to 1 part of your vermouth. That could be a very dry martini. Whereas as we move through the spectrum, we get our dry martinis, we get our kind of wet martinis. There's such thing as a 50-50 martini, which is half and half, or you can even go for a reverse martini or an inverted martini, which leads with the vermouth. So as I said here, there's no right and wrong. You might want a very boozy, high ABV drink. You might want a more complex, kind of floral, lower ABV drink. So if you're not sure where to start with this, I'd perhaps recommend starting with a 4-to-1 ratio. So 4 parts or 60 mils of your spirit. I'm going gin, but you could try vodka, to 1 part or 15 mils of your vermouth, your aromatized wine. And that's a really nice starting point. It's got enough of the vermouth coming through to give it that kind of complexity, but also plenty of spirit to still be very much a gin or vodka-based drink. So that's a good starting point. Work on that entire spectrum, make a decision, and then we can move on to our next point, which is going to be whether we have bitters or no bitters. So when it comes to adding bitters to a martini, I think we need to think back to that Martinez, which I was speaking as a precursor to the martini. So that had its gin base, it had vermouth, which was usually sweet vermouth, but then kind of became a drier vermouth, and it also had maraschino liqueur and orange bitters. And a lot of people like to add orange bitters to a martini. I think maybe it's a remnant of that kind of lineage working its way down to the martini. But my personal preference here is not to. We don't want the drink to be kind of a really bitter drink, in my own opinion, but maybe you disagree. So if you like things to be a little bit more pithy, a little bit more kind of citrus forward, feel free to add a couple of drops. And if you disagree with any of this, or you agree with any of this, make sure you let me know in the comments, because as I said, there's no perfect martini, but I want to hear about your perfect martini. So now we've decided in this recipe not to go for bitters, we can start thinking about the next point, which is the mixing method. So the question you probably think about when you order a martini is shaken or stirred. And it's actually a really important decision to make. If you shake the drink, which I think is not optimal, you're going to really liven it up, lose some of the kind of clarity and the transparency of the drink, but it will be more vibrant, a little bit more alive and kind of bubbly. Whereas if you stir the drink over ice, which is my own personal preference, you get a little bit more elegance in the drink. I think you get a little bit more clarity of flavor, and whichever ingredients you go for really come through quite vividly. Whereas if you shake them up, they get a little bit all over the place and lost. So personally, we're going to be stirring this, but if you prefer it shaken, who am I to argue? James Bond likes it that way, so some of you might as well. So now we've covered how we're going to mix the drink together, we need to start thinking about a really important factor which I think is often overlooked, which is the dilution of your martini. So when it comes to the dilution of your martini, this is a really important thing to think about. So if it's under-diluted to your taste, it might be too kind of boozy, too spirit forward and not really that drinkable. Whereas if it's over-diluted, it's going to be watery, a little bit thin, and perhaps not what you're looking for in that kind of intensity level when it comes to the martini. For my own taste, I really like a 25% dilution. So if you weigh the drink before you stir it down with ice versus the final drink after you've stirred it down with ice, you've got 25% more liquid. And this is really easy to measure. In fact, I did a full episode about ice and dilution, which I'll put just here, which you can watch. But as a starting point, maybe 25 to 30% would be really good. But if you're stirring it down, wait till the ice kind of rounds out, wait till the glass gets really chilled, and you're probably going to be roughly in that zone. So don't underdo it, don't overdo it, but if you want to be really precise, you can measure it and repeat that over and over again every time you make a martini. So now we've made some big decisions about how the drink's going to taste and how it's going to feel in our mouth. We need to start thinking about how the drink's going to look and how it's going to be finished off, starting with the glass that we choose. So when it comes to choosing a glass for your martini, there are 3 things to think about. Number 1, is it the right size for your martini? It shouldn't be too big that you're going to have, 100 mils of vodka or gin to fill it. Number 2, do you like it? Do you like the look of it? Do you like the feel of it? Do you like how it kind of carries the drink and brings the aroma to your nose? And then number 3, not really a decision, more of a recommendation, it needs to be really, really cold. So whichever martini you're making, get that glass in the freezer if you can. If not, put some ice in there, get it really, really nice and cold. And then that's really critical to this drink. A good martini is spoiled by not being cold enough, but if you want to get the very best out of your martini, it wants to be really, really nice and cold. So once we've got that, we can think about our final element, which is going to be our garnish. So when it comes to garnishing a martini, there are probably 2 primary options for a classic martini. Number 1 is going to be an olive. Number 2 is going to be a lemon zest twist. There are other options. You could do something like a pickled onion in a Gibson martini, but that does stray away from our classic template. And I really like to go for an olive. If you're familiar with this course or with this channel, you know I like to add a little bit of seasoning to my drinks in the form of either salt or something that kind of brings a little bit of variation to the drink, maybe vanilla. But I really like an olive because it brings that really nice kind of savory mouthfeel, a little bit of saltiness and umami. And I think in a martini, that's really, really welcome. We've got all the complexity from the gin or the vodka, got all the complexity from the vermouth, and that olive just makes you kind of want more and more of it. And these olives, not sponsored, are the best olives in the world that I've ever tried. Perello olives, give them a try if you can get hold of them. If you want to take this one step further, you can actually add a little bit of the olive brand to your martini to make what's called a dirty martini. But if you want a fresher take on the martini, you can just remove a little bit of lemon peel, express this over the drink, and just tidy it up for a really pretty and kind of citric and fresh garnish. So now we've talked about all the 7 things you can think about. I've kind of told you my 7 preferences. I'm going to make my own perfect martini, which I think is going to be a really good starting point for you as well. So let's make a martini. Okay, so for this martini, we're going to start with our chilled frozen gin, and I'm going to go with 60 mils of this, which is going to be 4 parts. And I'm also stirring this down in a nice chilled mixing glass, which really does help things along to get it nice and cold. So 60 mils of that. We're going to go 15 mils or 1 part of my wine-based aperitif, which is going to be Cocky Americano. We're going to forego the bitters, but you'd add them now, maybe 2 or 3 dashes, and then we're going to stir this down with plenty of ice. So we're just going to stir this down for around about 30 to 45 seconds, aiming for that 25 to 30% dilution. So now that's really nice and cold, I'm just going to strain this into my frozen glass. Very happy with that. And we have our martini, which we're just going to finish off with an olive. And there we have what I consider to be the perfect martini, which may also be yours. Experiment, let me know which one ends up being your favorite, and enjoy.